Hello, Craig McCormack here again from the Governance and Assurance Unit, continuing general induction, and this time presenting part 2, hazard and risk management. When we're talking about hazards, what we're talking about is a circumstance that has potential for injury or harm. Risk is the realization of that injury or harm, and we also want to mention opportunity. Risk and opportunity often are mentioned side by side, and they're all virtually the opposite of each other. If there is a risk of something going wrong, we can also turn that over and see it as an opportunity of something going right. So the standards in particular talk about risk and opportunity, but we often zero in on the risk factor, which is understandable. It's more predominant than opportunity. But when you are thinking risk, also, if you can, please remember opportunity as well. What I wanted to emphasize with this diagram is two things. Firstly, that risk and opportunity, even though we often think about workplace health and safety, understandably, they also drive quality management and environmental management. So we use risk and opportunity to drive quality, safety, and environmental management. I'd also like to highlight that if you are working within the business on something, or you're doing an activity, or something is going on, there is a good chance, actually it's essential, that whatever you're doing will relate to some sort of risk or opportunity. Everything we do to manage quality, safety and environmental performance relates to a risk or an opportunity. If you can't think of a risk that you're avoiding or an opportunity that you're pursuing with whatever activity you're doing, the question is, why would you be doing such a thing? If it's not saving us from harm or benefiting the business, there's no point to actually be undertaking that activity at all. The reason risk management really has a workplace health and safety bent is largely because of it's driven by the legislation, which is very predominantly mentions risk management. So no surprise here that as we start to get into this subject, things like the Workplace Health and Safety Act and regulations come up. Section 19, for instance, talks about the person conducting a business activity, making a safe workplace for the workers. Section 20 talks about the duty of workers of taking reasonable care of their health and safety. Chapter 3 in the regulations gives specific instructions on how we're supposed to manage hazards and risks and what we're supposed to do to control them. And Chapter 6, which refers to construction activities, part of our business, includes things like high-risk construction works and safe work method statements also, which include a level of risk management. So no surprise here that risk management is starting to take on a fairly large work health and safety focus because the legislation really does hone in on that. There are also some other requirements. The Australian standards, all three, quality, safety and environmental standards, mention risk and opportunity management, and they really are risk-based thinking is one of the fundamental principles within those standards. Lots of the workplace health and safety codes of practice, and there's many of those documents, basically adopt a risk management approach. They don't really tell you what to do, they tell you to undertake risk management. So we need to understand what is risk management so that we can follow the instruction of those codes. And of course, in part 1 of our general induction, we discussed the Hartecs quality, safety and environmental policies, and all of those included an appreciation for the importance of risk management. So one of the other reasons that we need to do hazard and risk identification and management is also driven by our policies. Hazard and risk management is a relatively simple process when you look at it. We can see over here, we firstly need to identify a hazard. How we actually do that might vary. We might come across a hazard and just it appears in front of us and we know, oh, there's a hazard, we need to do something about that. Or we might have a deliberate exercise where we undertake a bit of a hazard evaluation process. We then assess the risk to determine if that hazard is a real concern. You might identify a hazard, but when you look at the risks associated with that hazard, low consequence, low likelihood, so do we really need to do anything about it, or is it just a fact of life? We then move on from assessing the risk to determining any controls that need to be implemented, and of course then communicating those controls and implementing those controls. Note too that when we are determining the controls, we need to exercise that process using the hierarchy of controls, which we will talk about shortly. Once we've implemented controls, we also get some sort of feedback mechanisms happening. We might undertake some observations and notice that things aren't as good as we would like, and we need to go back through the process and reevaluate. We also have some checks, as in inspections and audits, that will undertake an evaluation to make sure that our controls are adequate. If they're not, we need to go back and have a look. Have we underestimated the risk, or are our controls not as good as they should be? And of course, we can have non-conformances, incidents, and other reportable events that get us to go back during investigation and assess what did we do right or wrong during our hazard and risk management process that we need to change and get this process working. Down here, I've also just listed a couple of the activities. These are not exclusive, but some of the examples of assessment activities you might come across in the business are when you're developing a risk register, either at a corporate or a project level, when you're doing some of your project planning. During a daily pre-start activity, you will talk about hazards that you're going to face during the day and how you're going to control those associated risks. When doing a safe work method statement for high risk construction works, and of course take 5, which is a very personal activity where you just prior to an activity or a task, you do a bit of a take 5 to evaluate. Well, hang on, are there any hazards that I need to accommodate here? What are the risks associated with this? What controls do I need to implement, and take it from there? So it's a very basic process. Most of us are fairly familiar with hazard identification and risk management, but there it is in a nutshell, and you need to make sure that we do follow that process and keep that working. All right, I spoke earlier about the hierarchy of control. This is legislated, so there is no argument here. A lot of people think, oh, well, that gives us a choice of many options, but in fact, the legislation isn't written that you can just pick and choose. You can't just go straight to personal protective equipment and say, oh yeah, we've picked something out of the list. The first thing the legislation requires is that you eliminate risk if reasonably practical or to do so. Okay, so you must eliminate risk if it is reasonably practicable to do so. Only if it is not reasonably practicable to do so may you then move to step 2, which is minimize the risk. Again, we're talking about to a reasonable, whatever is reasonably practicable to do so. And you can only minimize risk by either substituting the process by something that provides lesser risk, isolating that hazard from exposed persons, or implementing engineering controls. Once again, you can't just step down to administrative controls if it's reasonably practicable for you to minimize the risk. If not, then we come into administrative controls. You can implement controls in place, processes, checks, balances, and so forth, or instructions, controls such as inducting people and giving them very clear, like a safe work method statement, for instance, is an administrative control. Here's a document that helps you control this risk. Then if by this stage of the process you haven't adequately eliminated the risk, you have the option for personal protective equipment. But as you can see, it is the last option on the hierarchy of controls. You really need to do that elimination, minimize, administrative controls first, and then you've got the option for personal protective equipment. So look, I know there's been a quick run through, and perhaps I get a bit excited about risk management, but it's very important, and it really does form the basis of our business. Everything we do is related in some way to either controlling a risk to minimize injury or harm, or to take advantage of an opportunity. I see it as really the hub of everything we do. Hazard and identification and risk management. From there, we determine how our business runs. So that's it for part 2. We'll see you shortly talking in part 3 about work health and safety. Thanks for watching.